All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring the early life of one of literature's most enduring characters, David Copperfield. And we're doing it through the lens of some key excerpts that really highlight those formative experiences.
I think what's so fascinating about revisiting these excerpts is the sheer range of experiences that David has, even in these early chapters. We have everything from those intricate family dynamics to his harrowing time at school, and even those first tentative steps into friendship and early love.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is remarkable how much ground Dickens covers in just these early chapters, right? I mean, and so artfully. And the way he manages to weave those threads together, those different aspects of David's life, it really gives you this incredible sense of the forces that are shaping him.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this deep dive so compelling, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just about understanding David's individual experiences. It's also about recognizing those universal themes of childhood, of loss, of resilience, of the search for connection and belonging that we all, can relate to in some way.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes David Copperfield such an enduring character, right? He's so deeply human, so relatable. And even though he's living in Victorian England, the emotions he's experiencing, those are timeless. Those are things we all grapple with.
Precisely. So let's jump right in, shall we? And I think a really natural place to start is with that dramatic moment right after David's father's death. We're introduced almost immediately to Miss Betsey Trotwood, this rather imposing figure who bursts into David's already fragile world.
Oh, yeah. Miss Betsy's arrival, I mean, talk about a disruption, right? She just descends on the house, and you instantly get this sense of tension. And I don't know if you noticed this for you listeners out there, but there's that really deliberate emphasis she puts on the phrase Mrs. David Copperfield when she's addressing David's mother. It's almost like she's making a statement, maybe passing a judgment. What do you make of that?
That pointed phrasing, I think, hints at a few things. First, for you to think about, there might be some pre-existing tension there, some history, or maybe even a clash of personalities.
Right.
But also, that emphasis on David's mother's married status, it could suggest that the Miss Betsy has some pretty strong opinions about women's roles, about social expectations, and that's something that, as we go further into the text, we see play out in a variety of ways.
And the atmosphere in David's home, I mean, the way Dickens contrasts those different spaces, it's so vivid. You have Peggotty's kitchen, this warm, inviting haven. I mean, what are some of those sensory details that really jumped out at you?
Oh, it's all there, isn't it? The glowing fire, the shining dresser, the smell of cooking. It's this space of comfort and predictability, which for a child experiencing such upheaval, that can be so grounding, so crucial.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but then you have that stark contrast with the best parlor,
Mhm.
this room it's almost suffocating, right? It's draped in this doleful air, and it's forever linked with his father's funeral, these heavy memories. Even the storeroom, with all its peculiar objects and that musty smell, it takes on this kind of eerie, almost sinister quality in David's mind.
Right. And that specific memory of his mother reading to him about Lazarus in that very parlor. It's this really powerful image of how those boundaries between stories and reality can blur for a child, especially in a time of grief.
It's a memory that definitely lingers, doesn't it? And then we have another really memorable character introduced, Mrs. Gummidge, with her constant lament, "I am a lone, lorn creature." What strikes you about her introduction?
Well, that's interesting, right? Because it's not just that she's sad. She's aware of how her sadness, how her misfortunes are shaping her personality. She calls herself contrary
Yeah.
and blames it on her troubles. And I think for you can see Dickens already starting to explore those complex layers of character, even in these seemingly minor figures.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mr. Peggotty's patience with her, I mean, the way he gently responds to her, it really speaks volumes about the kind of family unit they are, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It sets up this really important contrast with the Murdstones, right? This baseline of empathy and care that David experiences early on.
Right. And speaking of the Murdstones, their arrival, I mean, talk about a shift in tone. All of a sudden, there's this palpable sense of dread, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting how Dickens does that, right? He doesn't give us a lot of explicit details at first. It's more about that feeling, that atmosphere, like that moment where Peggotty takes David into the kitchen and shuts the door.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly what's happened, but we know it's not good.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things Dickens does so brilliantly, right? He creates that suspense, that sense of foreboding without having to spell everything out for the reader. And then the Murdstones, I mean, they just cast this shadow over everything, over David's education, over his home life.
Their attempts at teaching David are almost painful to read, aren't they? It's clear that they have no understanding of how children learn. They just want him to be this miniature adult capable of absorbing information on demand.
Right. And Mr. Murdstone, with his mounting impatience, I mean, you can practically feel the tension in the room during those failed lessons.
It's almost like he sees David's natural curiosity, his tendency to get distracted as some kind of moral failing. And that lack of empathy, that inability to see the world from a child's perspective, it really sets the stage for the abuse that follows.
And then that period of confinement, those 5 years of remembrance, as David calls them, it's such a powerful depiction of isolation, of that sense of being utterly cut off. What do you think Dickens is trying to convey about the impact of that kind of isolation on a young mind?
Well, think about it. David is surrounded by the sounds of life going on around him, right? The bells, the closing doors, the muffled voices. But he's excluded from it all. He's trapped in this solitary world of his own. And that's a kind of psychological torture, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And even those seemingly positive sounds like laughter or music, they just heighten his sense of alienation, wouldn't you say?
Precisely. They become this constant reminder of what he's missing, of what he's been denied. And that can be incredibly damaging to a child's sense of self-worth.
But even in the midst of all this darkness, there are these glimmers of light, these moments of humor and connection. And one that really stands out for me is the introduction of Mr. Barkis and that wonderfully indirect marriage proposal he makes to Peggotty, delivered through David. Barkis is willing.
Oh, it's so charming, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
so quintessentially Dickensian and
Yeah.
and reminds us that even in the bleakest of circumstances, life goes on. Love finds a way.
Right. And speaking of bleak circumstances, let's move on to Salem House. I mean, the way Dickwick describes David's arrival at this institution, it's chilling.
It's this stark, unforgiving place, right? This square brick building with wings, but so bare and unfurnished. And that silence upon his arrival, it's almost as if the building itself is holding its breath, waiting to unleash its horrors.
And the schoolroom, I mean, talk about depressing, right? Those long, bare rows of desks, the littered floor, the abandoned silkworm houses with those poor little mice, and that solitary bird in its tiny cage. I mean, every detail just screams neglect and a lack of any kind of joy or vitality.
And the smells, right. I mean, think about those specific smells. Mildewed corduroys, sweet apples wanting air, and rotten books. It's this really visceral assault on the senses that just reinforces the sense of decay and unwholesomeness of the place.
It really is. And then, of course, there's Mr. Creakle. I mean, his physical presence is so striking, isn't it? That contrast between his almost non-existent voice and his fiery red face, it's so unsettling.
That placard he makes David wear, the one that says "teeth are to be filed," it's just this incredibly cruel and humiliating act. And it really sets the stage for the kind of arbitrary and often sadistic punishment that he inflicts on the boys.
And it's interesting, right? Because he seems to take a particular delight in punishing those chubby boys like David. It's almost like he's targeting those who are perceived as more vulnerable.
Right. And I think for you as the reader or listener, it really brings to the forefront that question of power dynamics, of how those in positions of authority can abuse that power, especially when it comes to children.
And yet, in this really harsh and unforgiving environment, you have Steerforth, and there's that rumor that even Creakle's afraid to lay a hand on him. What does that tell you about the kind of social hierarchy that exists even within this place of punishment?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because it shows that even in a place like Salem House, there's still this pecking order, this sense of who has power and who doesn't. And Steerforth, with his charisma and his almost effortless defiance, he clearly occupies a very different position than someone like David.
He really does. And then you have Mr. Mell, who seems to be one of the few decent adults in that entire place. And his confrontation with Steerforth, it's such a powerful moment, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's this small act of rebellion,
Right.
This refusal to be belittled.
Yeah.
And it's significant because it shows that even in the face of overwhelming power, it's still possible to stand up for yourself, to speak truth to power.
And then his departure from the school, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And the fact that Creakle praises Steerforth and punishes Traddles for simply showing sadness at Mel's leaving, it really says a lot about about the kind of twisted morality at play in Salem House.
Right. It shows how arbitrary and how unjust that system can be. And it also foreshadows, I think, some of the challenges that David is going to face later on when he encounters those who wield power in equally corrupt ways.
And yet, despite all of that, David does form this friendship with Steerforth, right? He's drawn to him. He seeks him out for kindness, and I think that really speaks to David's need for connection, his yearning for something positive in that really bleak environment.
And there's that really sweet detail, right, where David is so eager to bring Steerforth to Peggotty's boathouse. It's like he's trying to share this little piece of warmth and happiness from his past with this new friend, with this person who he clearly admires.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to David's innocence at this point, right? He doesn't fully grasp the power dynamic at play in that friendship. He's just drawn to Steerforth the charm and that sense of protection that he offers.
And that dynamic, that imbalance of power, it's something that's going to become increasingly important as their friendship unfolds.
All right, so let's shift our focus now back to David's home life. And I think it's really important to highlight Peggotty's role here. I mean, she's such a rock for both David and his mother.
Her loyalty is it's unwavering, isn't it? I mean, she's constantly trying to protect David's mother from the Murdstones' influence. And you can see that she senses the danger, the manipulative nature of their intentions.
Yeah, but David's mother, she seems almost willfully blind to it, doesn't she? I mean,
No.
she's so desperate for security, for someone to take care of her that she just ignores all the warning signs.
It's a really tragic situation.
Yeah.
And it really highlights, I think, the vulnerability of women in that time period, especially those who were widowed and left without financial means.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we have the devastating blow of David's mother's death. And the way he describes his reaction, it's so raw, so visceral. He instantly feels the weight of being an orphan.
That desolate cry that he lets out, it's really gut-wrenching. And then that shift into this kind of numbed state of grief, it's a really powerful depiction of how children process trauma, how they try to make sense of such a profound loss.
And then Peggotty's grief, I mean, it's so palpable, so heartbreaking, especially that moment where she recalls the last time she saw David's mother truly happy. And that premonition she has of never seeing David again. It's like she knows that their lives are about to be irrevocably changed.
And the detail about David's mother confessing to Mr. Murdstone shortly before her death,
Yeah.
it really hints at that last minute realization, that regret for allowing herself to be manipulated, for not listening to Peggotty's warnings.
Yeah, it's a really powerful moment. And even Mrs. Gummidge, I mean, her sadness seems to deepen, doesn't it? It's like grief has just become this permanent fixture in her life.
Right, and that's something that I think a lot of people who have experienced loss can relate to. That feeling that the grief never really goes away. It just becomes a part of who you are.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we have that really sweet moment with young Ham. He so readily agrees with David's wish that Mr. Peggotty could be his guardian. It really speaks to the warmth and the genuine affection that the Peggotty family represents for David.
Yeah, and that contrast with Steerforth's reaction, that dismissive laughter when David expresses his gratitude for his kindness. I mean, it's such a stark reminder of how different those two characters are, and the potential danger that Steerforth represents for David.
Right, because Steerforth, he doesn't really understand true connection, does he? He's all about charm and superficiality, and that's a dangerous combination for someone like David, who's so eager to please, so desperate for approval.
Absolutely. So we've seen David experience loss. We've seen him face abuse and neglect both at home and at school, and now we enter this really difficult period where he's essentially abandoned by the Murdstones. He's left to fend for himself intellectually and emotionally.
And his yearning for education, I mean, it's so palpable. He's starving for knowledge, for any kind of intellectual stimulation, and that's just being completely denied to him by the Murdstones.
And it's not just the formal education, right? It's that basic need for connection, for someone to notice him, to engage with him on an intellectual level, and that lack of attention, of care. It really takes a toll on him.
It really does. And then we have the exit of the Micawbers facing their perpetual financial woes. But even in their departure, there's this this sort of Micawber-esque flair, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Mrs. Micawber with her grand pronouncements and her unwavering loyalty to her husband. I mean, even in the midst of crisis, they still manage to maintain that sense of theatrical optimism.
It's really quite remarkable. And then we have David's decision to run away. I mean, talk about a desperate act, right? He has practically nothing with him, but he's so determined to escape that horrible situation.
And the way Dickens describes that journey, it's so visceral. You can feel David's fear, his hunger, his exhaustion. It's a really powerful reminder of the lengths that children will go to when they're desperate to find safety, to find a better life.
And it all leads him to Aunt Betsy. And her return is such a pivotal moment in the story. I mean, she's still this formidable, somewhat eccentric figure, but there's also this sense that she might offer David the kind of protection and stability that he's been so desperately lacking.
And it's interesting, right? Because she's not this warm, fuzzy aunt figure. She's very much her own person. She has her own quirks, her own strong opinions, but there's also this underlying sense of decency, of a willingness to do what's right by David.
And then we're introduced to Mr. Dick with his preoccupation with King Charles I. It's such a quirky detail, and it adds this layer of gentle humor to the story.
Right. And I think it also speaks to Dickens's ability to create these really memorable characters, even those who might seem on the surface like minor figures.
And there's that great little anecdote about Dr. Strong's proposal to Annie, told by the old soldier. It's so funny, and it really highlights that kind of unconventional romance.
It's a reminder that love can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and that even in the most unlikely of circumstances, it can still find a way to blossom.
And then we get those letters from Peggotty bringing news of the world David has left behind. And it's interesting, right? He chooses not to mention Emily in his letters back to his aunt. I mean, what do you make of that decision?
I think it speaks to David's protectiveness over Emily, right? He senses that his aunt might not approve of their friendship, and he wants to shield Emily from any potential criticism or judgment.
And it's interesting, right? Because it also hints at the social complexities of the time, the way that class and status played such a significant role in people's relationships.
Absolutely. And those social complexities are something that Dickens is going to explore in a lot more depth as the story progresses.
So Aunt Betsy, despite her eccentricities, she clearly takes a genuine interest in David's well-being, doesn't she? I mean, she visits him at Dr. Strong's, she observes his progress, and eventually, she seems to approve of his development.
And that gradual shift in her demeanor, it's really heartwarming to see.
Yeah.
Because it shows that beneath that tough exterior, there's a real capacity for love and a genuine concern for David's future.
Okay, so let's talk about Uriah Heep. I mean, his introduction, it just immediately sets off alarm bells, doesn't it? That exaggerated humility, that constant self-deprecation, it's all so insincere.
That humbleness that he's always talking about, it's so creepy, so calculated. And Dickens does such a great job of using Uriah's physical appearance to reinforce that sense of something being not quite right.
Oh, yeah. The way he describes his pale, clammy hands, his greasy hair, it's also deliberately repulsive. And then his mother, the fact that she looks almost exactly like him, it just adds to that sense of something being off, something being morally corrupt about the whole Heap household.
Right. It's like their physical appearance is a manifestation of their inner ugliness, their moral decay.
And in contrast to that, we have David's, his first innocent romance with Miss Larkins. It's such a sweet little interlude, and it really speaks to David's capacity for love, for those pure youthful affections.
And it's also a reminder, I think, of David's age, right? He's still just a boy, and he's experiencing all these really intense, really complicated things. But he's also still capable of these moments of simple joy and innocent love.
Absolutely. And then his move to London, I mean, that's a really significant step for David, right? He's striking out on his own. He's trying to find his place in the world. And Aunt Betsy, bless her heart, she continues to support him even after she's lost her own fortune.
It's really a testament to her character, isn't it? I mean, she's been through so much, but she still prioritizes David's well-being. And her advice to him is always so practical, so grounded. she's a really great mentor figure for him in a lot of ways.
She really is. And then that reunion with Steerforth at the end, it's so characteristic of Steerforth, right? He just swoops in and takes charge of the situation, making sure David gets a better room. And it's all so effortless for him, so charming.
And David is just completely smitten, right?
Right.
He's so impressed by Steerforth's confidence, by his social ease, and I think that really speaks to David's own insecurities, his longing for that kind of effortless charm.
Absolutely. And then we have the introduction of Miss Rosa Dartle with her piercing gaze and that really prominent scar on her lip. I mean, she's such a fascinating and slightly unsettling character, isn't she?
Oh, absolutely. And that scar, it's such a powerful symbol, right?
Hmm.
It's this outward mark of some past trauma, some hidden pain that she carries with her, and it really foreshadows the darkness that's lurking beneath the surface of Steerforth's world.
Right, because Steerforth eventually reveals that he was the one who caused that scar, and it's just this really chilling moment because it shows that beneath that charming facade, there's this capacity for violence, for cruelty.
And it's interesting how casually he admits it, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just this minor incident from his past, and
Mhm.
and that really speaks to his lack of empathy, his inability to fully grasp the consequences of his actions.
Okay, let's jump back to Yarmouth for a moment, and we have that really beautiful scene where Mr. Peggotty is talking about his love for Emily,
Yeah.
and he contrasts it with Mrs. Gummidge's melancholy. What does that tell you about the different ways that people experience and express love?
Well, I think it speaks to the depth and the purity of Mr. Peggotty's love for Emily. It's
Hmm.
this unconditional, almost fatherly love. And it's a really powerful contrast to Mrs. Gummidge's,
Hmm.
her sadness, her sense of being lost and alone.
And it really highlights that theme of family, of those bonds of loyalty and affection that are so central to the novel.
Absolutely. And those bonds are going to be tested in some really profound ways as the story unfolds.
So David and Steerforth spend some time in Yarmouth, and it seems like a happy, carefree time on the surface. But do you sense any underlying tensions there? Any foreshadowing of future conflict?
Well, there's that line where Dickens describes Steerforth's restless nature and bold spirits. And I think that really hints at the potential for trouble. Because Steerforth, he's not content with a simple, quiet life. He needs constant stimulation, constant excitement. And that's going to lead him down a very dangerous path.
And then we're introduced to Miss Moucher, and she's such a lively and insightful character, isn't she? I mean, she's physically small, but she has this huge personality, this sharp wit.
Yeah, and she's really perceptive. She sees right through people, and she's not afraid to speak her mind. And that makes her a really dangerous adversary for someone like Steerforth, who's so used to getting his own way.
Absolutely. And then we have Hams, his devotion to Emily. I mean, the way he carries her little purse, it's such a small gesture, but it speaks volumes about the depth of his love for her, his protectiveness.
And and that little moment where she kisses him, it's so innocent, so pure, but it also hints at the complexities of their relationship, the potential for things to change, to become more complicated.
And the fact that David chooses to keep that moment a secret, it really speaks to his loyalty to both of them, to his desire to protect their friendship.
Right. He's still very much a child in a lot of ways, and he doesn't quite understand the implications of that moment, but he senses that it's important, that it's something that needs to be protected.
So David returns to London, and he's met by Aunt Betsy. And she's still her usual quirky self with her worries about fire, but there's also this sense of stability, of
Mhm.
continuity that she represents for David, even amidst all the chaos and uncertainty of his life.
And they have these really interesting conversations about David's future career, right? And it's clear that David is starting to think about what he wants to do with his life, what kind of man he wants to become.
But then Aunt Betsy just disappears. And that's such a strange and unsettling moment. It's like the rug has been pulled out from under David's feet.
And it really highlights how precarious his situation is, right? I mean, he's still so dependent on others, and when those people are taken away, it's really frightening for him.
And then Agnes, bless her heart, she steps in with her usual wisdom and her gentle guidance, and she warns David about Steerforth, and it's clear that she sees something in Steerforth that David is missing, that he's choosing to ignore.
And I think it's important to note that Agnes isn't jealous of Steerforth, right? She's genuinely concerned for David's well-being. And that's what makes her such a trustworthy and valuable friend to him.
And she knows that David is inherently trusting, that he sees the best in people, and she's not trying to force him to change his opinion of Steerforth. She just wants him to be careful, to be aware of the potential dangers.
And I think that's a really valuable lesson for all of us, right? To
Yeah.
to be discerning in our friendships, to be aware of the fact that not everyone has our best interests at heart.
Absolutely. And then we have David's dinner with the Waterbrooks where he meets Traddles, and it's interesting to see David starting to expand his social circle to meet people from different walks of life.
Right. And Traddles is such a great character, right? He's so hardworking, so optimistic, even though he's constantly struggling to make ends meet. He's a really great foil for David in a lot of ways.
He really is. And then of course we have the return of Uriah Heep, and he's just as creepy and manipulative as ever, and his conversation with David, it's full of these veiled threats and innuendos.
And it's clear that he has his sights set on Agnes.
Mm.
And that's really unsettling, especially considering the power dynamic that's at play there.
And then we get Mr. Spenlow's, his rather cynical view of the legal profession. And it's interesting, right? Because it shows the reality of that world, the way that money and status can corrupt even those who are supposed to uphold the law.
And it's a world that David is going to have to navigate. He's going to have to figure out how to maintain his own integrity, his own sense of right and wrong in the midst of all that corruption.
And then Aunt Betsy shows up at Mr. Spenlow's office. I mean, talk about a dramatic entrance, right? So she just bursts in and confronts Miss Murdstone. And it's such a satisfying moment because she finally puts Miss Murdstone in her place.
And Miss Murdstone she can't even meet Aunt Betsy's gaze. She's just completely cowed by her force of personality. It's a really great moment of triumph for Aunt Betsy and for David.
It really is. And then we have Mrs. Krupp with her rather eccentric advice about playing Skittles. And it's just this funny little moment that reminds us that even in the midst of all this drama, there's still room for humor, for those little moments of absurdity.
And it also speaks to the human need for distraction, for something to take our minds off of our troubles, even if it's just for a little while.
And then Traddles, bless his heart, he's still struggling to pay off his debts, but he's also so happy about his engagement to Sophie Kruller, and that's really inspiring to see.
It really is. It shows that even when things are tough, it's still possible to find joy, to find love, and that's a really important message, I think, especially for young people who are facing challenges.
And then we have that disastrous dinner party that David hosts. I mean, it's a comedy of errors, right? From Mrs. Krupp's sudden illness to the bright food, and it's a really funny scene. But it also shows how inexperienced David is when it comes to domestic matters.
And that's something that's going to continue to be a challenge for him, as we'll see. I mean, he's got